Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Mexico Center and the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute, we welcome you to this event that I think is going to be a terrific event because we have a very good lineup of speakers. As you saw in the program, we have first a presentation by Jesús Reyes Heroles, who is the former CEO of Pemex and former Secretary of Energy of Mexico. And we will have about 30 minutes presentation and maybe a few minutes for a couple of Q&A after that. And then we will have him and our other panelists, Lourdes Melgar, Miriam Gronstein, and Pablo Zárate, on a discussion of a very timely and important topic, which is the Mexican elections and what they could mean for the energy reform. And of course, since we are in Houston, we will focus mostly on the oil reform, on the oil part of the reform that, as you know, has been tremendously successful in many respects, but now faces the first sort of transition from the president that enacted the reform to a new president, and in a region like Latin America in which we have seen a lot of volatility in oil policy. Of course, this is an important event, and we want to discuss how it might impact the reform. So now I give you Jesús Reyes Heroles, so welcome him to the Baker Institute.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for inviting me, and second for your kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back at the Baker Institute. It brings me many remembrances about other times and other activities, but always very enjoyable. As you can, I prepared a few slides because I have a little bit of time and just like to have some visual backing for what I'm going to comment. And the title tells you what I'm going to try to address, okay? The issue of uncertainty in Mexico and its impact on energy reform. Everybody around the room is very well informed about what's going on in Mexico, so I will try to not repeat many things, but just put on the table what are the critical issues to be considered now. The country is in the country is prevailing a sentiment of disenchantment, of pessimism. Only the last survey of Pew said that 68% of Mexicans think that life today is worse than what it was 50 years ago. So that is only one signal there are many polls and other things that obviously illustrate the issue of this sentiment of disenchantment and pessimism. But the thing is that this sentiment, or social humor, however you want to call it, it comes up from a combination of some positive things, like Mexico's infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, I would say, in addition to others, and structural reforms, and negative effects, which is basically insecurity and corruption. And so you have now the political debate in Mexico like trapped or between those two forces. Only a couple of weeks ago, Ángel Gurría, the president of the OECD, was in Mexico, and I'm going to quote what he said, and what the report of the OECD says. This government, meaning the government of Mexico, has passed the most ambitious set of reforms that the OECD has witnessed in recent years. And then he illustrated that like the egg of an ostrich, because he was talking to some diplomats there who in turn have the responsibility of trying to explain and to clarify what's going on in Mexico. And his saying was, listen, I mean, if you see the reforms that this administration has instrumented, you really have like an egg of an ostrich. It's a huge package of reform that you can go out and sell. And we were then afterwards sort of discussing, I mean, the case of Mexico proves that reform works. There is no question about that. So you have that sort of reality and sentiment, and on the other hand, this disenchantment and pessimism. How is this possible? How is possible that despite these solid institutions and infrastructure and the ostrich egg phenomenon, pessimism prevails in such a strong way? It is a result of several things that I'm going to try to address now. First of all, a very close electoral competition. We certainly will have a chance to at least go over it very quickly. The Donald Trump effect and all the uncertainty that it has incorporated into the economic aspects of the Mexican economy. A deep and generalized sentiment of, not sentiment, a deep and generalized insecurity or lack of security in Mexico. Things are, as you know, very bad. And a corruption that permeates every aspect and every reality in the country, as at least I had never seen before. And from what I read, it has no clear precedent. And despite all this, investors, both Mexicans and foreigners, keep investing in Mexico. And the best example of that is only round 2.4 10 days ago, which was extremely successful. I would just mention that. But in this opening, I wanted to say, well, this is a reality, but the reading of a lot of this is different by different actors, and investors are there. So all of this constitutes a context of uncertainty in which we all, and many in this room, or all of you, will have to continue taking decisions. Let me go very quickly. Economic uncertainty. I mean, we have the NAFTA renegotiation with all these niceties and the compliments of the Twitters of the President of the U.S. The issue of volatile markets everywhere. I mean, it's not only in Mexico, and a volatile international environment. I mean, expected growth worldwide is not extraordinary. The U.S. is doing okay, and that's critically important for Mexico. And I just put those two graphs very quickly there. You can see on the left is the issue of the exchange rate and the changes that we have had, especially the fact that the dollar has appreciated itself. And on the right, this issue of industrial production in the U.S. and in Mexico. And what you see there at the very end is, the industrial production in the U.S. is going up, but Mexico's is not going up. Usually they go in the same direction, as you can see in the rest of the graph. So let's watch very carefully over the next couple of months what is going to happen. Now, that is all what I'm going to say about economic uncertainty, although we could spend a whole morning talking about that. There is no time to do that. Now, then point number two is political uncertainty, and you have this complex electoral landscape, competitive and divided by thirds in general. Let me at least up to here use that figure. It's the largest concurrent election that never has no precedent in Mexico. There is a deep anti-PRI sentiment. 46% of the people would not vote for the PRI. That is a data from our company, but there is today in the Reforma, they published a new poll, And that poll has, it's close to 50% or over 50% who say they will never vote for the PRI. The approval rate of President Peña Nieto is very low, as you know. López Obrador, we have the phenomenon of López Obrador, who has been campaigning for the past 12 years, which is not, you cannot take it, you cannot overlook that. There is a anti-López Obrador sentiment of others, basically saying, well, anything can happen except for López Obrador to become president. So you have two sentiments there that will have to find out a solution at the end of this next electoral process. This emergence of a government, a coalition government, headed by Ricardo Anaya from the National Action Party, but it's a coalition, and it's the first time that we have a coalition campaign, a government coalition in that sense. Questions about the PRI's candidate and campaign strategy that you read every day. Basically, people are saying that the candidate has not the attributes. He could be an excellent president, but he doesn't have the attributes needed to campaign. And the other thing that is very more and more a sentiment or a vision in Mexico is that the campaign team is not good. It's not of the PRI. It's not good enough. And that now that stage of this process ended, that they should be changed. So I tend to concur that something will happen in regard to that, because the PRI will not continue and the president will not continue with this lack of performance at the campaign level. And finally, we have to remember that the electoral authorities are under scrutiny. They lost confidence. I don't remember now the numbers, but we polled them. If you want, I can send it to you. In the company, we have questions. For 14 years, we have been asking the people what they think about the electoral authorities. And the fact of the matter is that they are touching a bottom. Since the Federal Electoral Institute was converted or changed into the National Electoral Institute and taking over the surveillance of local elections, that was a disaster for the Federal Electoral Institute, and they had problems in Coahuila, and so their rate of approval went down, and we need them strong because the campaign is going to need or end up somehow with issues being discussed at the IFE. We have about 90 million people of potential voters with a participation rate of, say, 60%. That would be 54 million people. 12.9 of those are potential first-time voters. It's very important, young, and with a mindset, I wouldn't say a millennial mindset, but some kind of mixture there. And you have 54 million people of potential voters that are under 39. That basically means that they are hooked up to the cell and that they actually play with they play in the social networks. It's also good to remember that AMLO in 2006 and 2012, he got about 15 million votes, and that means would mean today, with these numbers, about 27% of total votes. Obviously, there are other voters that did not vote for him in 2006 or in 2012, but they are. Now, I'm not going to go over it, just see the size of the electoral process. I mean, you have 3,400 public officers, and then you have 9 state elections, and you have 2,700 local positions that all of those will be solved in one day, which it's a major logistical challenge, and it represents also a major political problematic, which is not easy to see. The newspapers today in the morning and the media in Mexico has been informing about strong divisions within the PRI as a result of the selection of the candidates of the PRI to the 3,406 elected political positions. So that is also causing has already caused a lot of stress within the PRI that only adds up to the sentiment that the campaign is being ineffective in the best, using mild words. No? Now, this is, today there's a poll of Reforma. I took this from February 14th, or so. This was published yesterday. Now, today is another one, but they are coincidental. So, as you can see, Andrés López Obrador at the top with in this poll with 27.1%, and Anaya going up, and it's even more obvious in Reforma's publication of today, and Mr. Meade going down. And the independents, they don't count very much. I mean, actually, in today's poll of Reforma, Margarita Zavala went down. Like she lost like 2 points or something like that in this. Now, and this next table there, it's very interesting because of those who have a preference, 60% is sure about their decision. That means that there's still 40% that is not sure and they have second choices. In a poll that we do in GEA, what we do is we ask them what their second choice is, and then we can sort of speculate of what are really the ranges, the range of votes that the different candidates have. Now, if you can see here, the most firm vote, actually, I have here this, the most firm vote here is for Andrés Manuel López Obrador. 74% of those say that they are completely committed to his, they're completely secure about their vote. And that has been the case for quite some time. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to enter in decomposing that vote, but this is the result. Now, given those numbers, and that 20% of the people or more are not saying yet for whom they are going to vote, 20, 22, something in that neighborhood, the electoral result is not defined. Although in many quarters the sentiment is that the electoral result is not defined. Mexico just finished the pre-campaign period. Now, I think all of the candidates were sent to the Tibet to meditate, because that is what the law says. So I imagine there everybody like that, smelling incienso, and thinking about, I don't know what, not the immortality of the flies. And but it's there, and it will be until March 30. And March 30, the campaign process will start full-fledged. So nothing is written. You will have all April, May, and June, 3 months, 90 days. It's 100 days, something like that. Of real campaign, and we will see then how these numbers are going to change. Now, one thing is true: whoever wins the next electoral campaign will not have majority in Congress, and that is an important thing to keep in mind. Much less qualified majority, which would allow the next president to really make changes, could allow him to make changes of the Constitution. And also, nobody would have a majority of the governorships of the states. This is one speculation. I was telling the assistant that helped me to put this into the PowerPoint here, that it's optimistic. I think that the PRI is not going to win one single gubernatorial race, but that's they say I'm very pessimistic in that sense. But as you can see, nobody really, it's 32 Nobody is really there, and you need, for approving a constitutional change, to have 17 of the local legislatures to approve the change. I'm trying to get to the point that there are multiple checks and balances in the Mexican system that are starting to figure out how they will act in regard to this complicated election. And you have the independence of the Supreme Court, which is very important, and the Supreme Court has gradually gained more confidence of the public opinion that it did lack only 10 or 15 years ago. You know about the independence, autonomy of the central bank. We have the Institute for Transparency, which is well reputed or regarded institution. We have the Statistical Institute, which is completely independent. We have the Energy Regulatory Commission, given that we're going to talk more about energy, which is an autonomous branch, and they have done a fairly good job in general. I will show up some problems later on, but it's then the National Hydrocarbons Commission, the National Competition Commission, who has shown more and more autonomy and independence and will of moving ahead, and others, including the Federal Telecommunications Institute, which is probably one of the least independent, but that's it. So despite this perceived uncertainty, investors keep quite firm, around 2.4, I mentioned that. It was 19 of 29 blocks were successfully warranted and awarded, and to 11 companies of 10 different countries. The results of the round was very good from every perspective. I think everybody's happy about that. Now, our energy reform. The stated objective of the reform was is still to accelerate economic growth based on increased investment, public and private, and maintain the investments of Pemex and CFE, not substitute them, but to keep that going on and add to that, basically, the a substantial increase of private investment in the hydrocarbon and in the electricity sector, which we are seeing. I mean, it is happening. I mean, it's not. It eliminated Pemex exclusivity in every point of the hydrocarbon value chain. So it was a major opening. I mean, it was not on the surface or limited. It's really very ambitious in that regard. And it did allow Pemex to associate, which was one of the biggest problems of Pemex before, and it was in the Constitution. And obviously, the whole reform, the most important merit of the whole reform is that it changed the Constitution. I mean, it's not something that it's in the law or that they're trying to circumvent the Constitution or something like it was done in the attempt to reform of energy reform in 2008. There was this crazy notion of, without reforming the Constitution, really getting an energy reform, which was absurd. Finally, Peña could do it and change the Constitution. Now, there are caveats and there are some problems with the reform, but the most important one, because it also tells us something about what's going on and about the future of the energy sector in Mexico, is the fact that Pemex and CFE were left in the federal budget. So that is the most absurd thing and the major mistake of the reform, because it left Pemex with plethora of all sorts of regulations, and obviously with ample interventions of the Treasury, who has kept squeezing out of Pemex as much as they can, and we can discuss that for a long time. But this is really something that, for me, it's a major blow of the reform. Now, 2 tracks of the energy reform, very quickly. Opening in the energy sector for participation of private parties. Responsible of that, the Ministry of Energy, the National Hydrocarbon Commission, and other regulators. And structural transformation of Pemex into an efficient and competitive company. The responsible there is the board and the management of the company. I rated them. The first track is like something in the neighborhood of 8.5. It's higher than the average of my students in ITAM, but I'm generous with that. Now, point B, it's really not only late, but very poor. I mean, the administration of President Peña Nieto has lost 6 years in regard to Pemex. It's not a trivial thing. And as we saw before, the energy reform included that Pemex had to play a role, obviously, with all the resources that were assigned to that and with the importance of the company. That has not happened and will not happen over the next 9 months or whatever is left of this administration. In the first examples of the first point, after 8 successful bidding processes, $153,000 billion for 91 contracts. It's not a trivial figure. It's really important and shows the commitment that is there. From national oil company to nearly 67 international, from one national oil company to nearly 67 international companies in the E&P activity. It's an impressive change. We are only talking about 3 years, 3 years and a half. And in the coming months, you still have around 3.1, 35 blocks in shallow waters and around 3.2, 37 blocks on onshore that will add up to these good numbers. Now, I will skip this one here. There are progress in other areas, in gas stations and storage and of fuels, new pipelines and other things. So it has been quite successful. The electricity aspect of the energy reform has done much less well than the hydrocarbon reform. And everything has been moving much more slower than what everybody wanted and everybody expected to be. There are still problems with regulations that are missing. And there are problems with some of the regulations that have been issued by the National Energy, the regulatory agency. Only they defined a few weeks ago the tariffs. And believe me, it's a nightmare what they produced. I mean, it's really absolutely crazy. And it is affecting companies, some of you, companies who already have assets in Mexico, or who were planning to buy assets in Mexico. I'm thinking about the electricity sector. So I won't touch upon the electricity sector, but it's going well behind the other thing. Now, margins to slow down the implementation of the energy reform, well, yes, but there are no majorities for constitutional or legal changes. None of the candidates will get that. So that obviously defines the margins for the process. They could follow up, any one of the winning candidates could slow down and drag their feet in regard to the implementation of energy reform. That's very, not only when you change parties, but even within the same parties, they get new people into office and so on. Could there be breach of contracts? Yes, of course, with the corresponding fines, and then also all the judicialization of the process that would come along with something like that. So it is not an easy thing to say. The new president of Mexico could really, get rid of the reform. Some of these things could happen, but that between this and saying the reform will be reverted or eliminated or canceled, that is not correct. Now, there's a risk, obviously, and the risk is really not reversing it, but the fact of losing opportunities for going ahead with the reform. Pending issues in regard to, from my view, it has, well, first of all, remove Pemex from the federal budget. If that happens, I'll invite you here for a cocktail party and on my wallet, okay? So I really hope somebody gets senseless there. Strengthen regulatory institutions. Several things have to be done, especially in the case of the agency in charge of environmental and security issues. It doesn't have the autonomy that other agencies have, and it's important. And there are other issues to strengthen the regulators. One critical question, I think the way it is spelled out here is not really correct, is if the next administration, whoever it is, from whatever political color, could, not cancel, but bring to an end the political agreement that was crafted in 2013, that to get the reform, the government adopted the compromise with the left, some groups of the left, not to sell assets of Pemex. I mean, there was a phrase of the Minister of Energy, Mr. Pedro Joaquin Colwell, who said, "We are not going to sell a bolt of existing assets of Pemex," which, by the way, has been the case, which in turn made it very difficult for Pemex to go through this period of low oil prices and its implications in terms of its financial situation. Even simple operations like sale and leaseback operations that Pemex could have done, like option number A or number 1 in the actions, financial actions that Pemex take, it couldn't be done because of this commitment. So the end of this administration, in my view, would imply the end of the commitment not to sell assets of Pemex. And that would open up the door for an IPO of Pemex, and or it would be a condition for an IPO of Pemex and CFE, with great positive impacts on transparency. I think when I was pushing or working for the reform in 2008, we invented there being able to Pemex to issue some bonds. There were some bonds related to the performance of the company. Why is it that, and I was behind it, we invented that in Pemex at that time and proposed that to the team who was working for the reform. It was for issues of transparency, to have some instrument in the stock exchange so that the market investors, the private investors, could be overlooking at that, and also to defend Pemex from the Treasury. Because, and it's even now the case, I mean, the Treasury can call in the morning and say, listen, I think we need a little bit more money. Why don't you duplicate the amount of resources that you are going to pay for taxes and rights, whatever, this week, no? It's still there. It is still within the budget. So the point there is an IPO as a way to defend the company from its owners, and at the same time to increase transparency. And I think there are many other changes that could be introduced in corporate governance, and appointing CEOs with longer terms. Now, the average life of a CEO of Pemex is 2.5 years. I'm a living proof of that. And also the issue of the chairmanship of the board, because up to now it has been the head of the Secretary of Energy, which has a very contradictory position, being defining the policy and also being the head of the company and also being, in charge of the regulatory apparatus of the system. So I leave it there. And I hope some of these ideas can be developed both now and afterwards during the panel. So how do we proceed? I mean, is anybody interested?
I have these cards to write questions. Can someone pick that question? There is, let me...
A ver, come up.
Maybe you can from there. One first question is, what would it take, you mentioned about removing Pemex from the federal budget, what would it take politically for this to happen? What conditions?
A constitutional reform.
It will require a constitutional reform. And do you think that's politically feasible? I mean, I guess because you offer drinks for everybody, you don't think it's too feasible?
I'm a risk taker. I think it depends. No, that would be a good. I mean, it really depends, and obviously to take, if we make a poll and ask public opinion, what would they think about taking Pemex out? Forget about public opinion. Ask legislators. I have done that informally, no, and all of them, well, not all doesn't exist, but a large majority of Congress people basically would say yes, we would need to take Pemex out of the budget, even if that, with all the implications that implies. So maybe for a constitutional reform like that, it could be a minor amendment, but at the same time very, very important. You could get, some kind of majority in the Congress to pass it through.
I mean, and the fiscal dependence on oil, of course, at the current price environment, it has not been as high. But how would you? Isn't that the reason?
The point is that, in principle, there's an implicit assumption in what I presented, and that is that the next Secretary of the Treasury really does his work, which is collecting, among other things, collecting taxes. Because it has been quite comfortable for several Treasury ministers in the past not to do a real fiscal reform because they had the cow of Pemex there to be milked. Yeah. And the results of the very poor current operational results of Pemex and financial results of Pemex has to do with the taxing issue. And they created a very, actually Lourdes was part of the people to be, who participated in that team. The fact that they say, no, we are going to reduce the taxes to Pemex, but gradually, as they move ahead with farm outs. And then when farm outs materialize, then we would reduce the tax rate applicable to Pemex. It was like conceived as an incentive for Pemex to move ahead, but it has not produced that, and the results are still there. Pemex is paying very significant amounts of resources to the Treasury, considering its sales and its revenues and all that, okay?
Questions are pouring in, so let me gather a few together. There are a bunch about Pemex itself. So one is, when you were the head of Pemex, what was the biggest challenge you identified, and what should Pemex do in the next 5 to 10 years to turn around production? What is your take about the trade unions in Pemex today? And is it possible to do a Pemex IPO under Andrés Manuel López Obrador? Or is it likely?
I'm not a magician I think that I'm also living proof that you cannot change Pemex from within. You needed something from outside to really put it in a position of stress that would allow the administration to change. And that was energy reform. That was, in a way, the aim of saying, okay, we need from the Congress and the public opinion something that changes the rules and forces Pemex to change. Forces even, let me say, the people who work in Pemex who have been there for many years, and some of them are extremely good technicians, and some of them, I don't complain about that, but obviously they were very comfortable in the position they had for quite some time, and they resisted change, and it didn't work. The union I have mixed feelings about the union. People tend to blame the union of all the problems that Pemex has, operational and other things. And that's not true, totally. When is the last time that you remember some facility of Pemex being closed by the workers of Pemex? Here is somebody who could raise the hand. When do you remember the oil workers union marching in the streets in Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City and blocking the circulation? Never. When do you remember the National Oil Union walking along with the people from Suterm, no? Not Suterm, from the el Sindicato de Luz y Fuerza, el SME, ¿sí? Or other combative unions? Never. They didn't march with the teachers when the whole thing. So that aspect, that has a value. Now, they are very well paid, yes, as compared with other salaries in Mexico, as is the case of every oil company in the world. And Houston is a very good example. I mean, you don't need to go too far away to actually see that. But that contributes to this notion that, well, and then, where is the problem, from my view, in regard to the union? And I tried, and I couldn't get more out of the union. Well, there was the financial issue of the pensions, which that was not a problem of the union, that was a problem of the Treasury, because those resources were generated by Pemex, but they were taken away by the Treasury. So I always coincided with the leader of the union that was not a problem of them. It was a problem of the government. Well, but the real critical point is the lack of flexibility to move and redefine the number of workers of the company. Like if you see, a drilling equipment, and you see the number of people who are there working with that, it's very large. Let's say, I'm going to invent the numbers, I used to know them, but let's say 8 guys, plus 1 for security or whatever, and you could operate that platform or that equipment with 4. That is, but it is even more significant in the refineries. The over hiring of people. They still keep workshops to do maintenance work in the refineries. That is obsolete. It has been obsolete for maybe 30 or 40 years. I mean, you hire somebody who is a specialized company, and they come and they change the catalytic tower, and they have the equipment, and you save in not having the equipment and the workers and so on. The Pemex has to close a plant somewhere, and there are 200 workers, and you talk to the union and you say, listen, why don't we have to close this plant, because this plant is losing money, and it doesn't do any good anymore. So these 200 workers, we are going to retrain them and to move them to something else. We can move them to refining, we can move them to upstream or whatever. And the response of the union, at least during my tenure of that, and even when I was Secretary of Energy, we had some issues related very similar to that. The response of the union is to say yes, but to do nothing. So you have, well, the people there have to build like a huge storage room with air conditioning and so on to have all those 200 people playing domino all day long because they are still there. The plant is already stopped, but they are still there. So the big problem with the union, in my view, this is my reading, is the fact that they do not cooperate in terms of the labor flexibility that you have to move workers from one point to another. And the last example of that, and a very painful example, is what happened with the plant of Mexichem, a little petrochemical facility in producing ethylene in Pajaritos that exploited. unexploited because the workers at this level were private technicians of Mexichem, but the rest of the thing were union workers that were that had a very high turnaround, and that they never learned, and they had no system to compensate them when they were responsible and performed well. That's an example of how much this lack of flexibility of the union prevents really Pemex to become a more profitable company.
There are a few questions on sort of elaborating a little bit on what could happen with the three different leading candidates in terms of the reform. And they ask, for example, what could happen if Anaya administration, with the influence of the PRD with respect to the reform, how will the administrative slowdowns that López Obrador might implement, how would it look like? And sort of, the three different scenarios with the three different candidates, if you can comment a little bit more on that.
Well, it really has to do with the people that they would incorporate into their energy team. Let me use that expression. There are lots of many people in Mexico who now know about the energy sector and the hydrocarbon sector. That used not to be the case until the very open public debate of 2008 that was held in 2008 organized by the Congress. There people started understanding the Pemex, the energy sector, the issues of reform, what has to be done, and so on. So you have people who have been legislators, people who have been workers of Pemex. Now you have people who are in the private sector and in these new companies that I was talking about, that are available or could be available to build or to constitute a very strong energy team. Now, the issue is who would call them? And I would say that José Antonio González Anaya certainly, and José Antonio González means José Antonio. Sorry, delete. No, so José Antonio Meade would do it, and Anaya has no problems. But López Obrador has already announced who would be in charge of his, who would be his secretary of energy and so on. And I leave it there. Read her bio, and then ask yourselves the question if that lady would actually call upon of the people who really understand what's going on in the energy sector.
We can squeeze one more on.
There is a lady here with a number. It says 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then it becomes red. Okay.
A very short one, but if in the downstream, if Pemex still controls the price, how will independents compete? Is the free market going to happen?
The price of what?
The gasoline, the downstream.
Well, actually, the price of gasoline is not controlled by Pemex. The price of gasoline is a market price. It's a worldwide. Fuels are commodities. No, so there is a political element that has to be considered from the very beginning. For Mexicans, the price of gasoline is right as long as it's not higher than the price of fuels or gasolines in the border with the U.S. And Mexico has followed for decades a fuels policy that is based on following up what's going on in the U.S., for good or for bad. I think for bad because, for example, we have done very little in inducing more consumption of diesel instead of gasolines, as is the case in Europe. But anyway, we could discuss that. I mean, we haven't had for quite some time a fuels policy. No, it's just follow what's happening in the border and don't go beyond that and don't stay too far away from that, and that will be it. And that will not change from a political perspective. So if you have the prices of the fuels in the international market defined, you can call Glencore or Trafigura or whoever you want, or all of them to feed you fuel. And then you have the fuel, the price of the fuel at the pump, defined by what it is on the other side. So that gives you a response. You have there a tax, it's called IEPS, Impuesto Especial sobre Producción y Servicio, which is really the variable part of the price. So they can go and the government can go and charge as much IEPS as it can, given the price in the border and the price in of the fuels in the international market. So that is what they are doing. They have been adjusting the IEPS. They adjusted to accommodate, to fulfill those two conditions. Obviously, the exchange rate also plays a role, and there are many other aspects, but that's at the end of the day, a very simplistic interpretation of the real margins to move around in terms of the price and the tax.
Well, thank you very much. So let's...